Okay, so let's look at the beginnings. The Ubaid period. Um, because they practiced irrigation agriculture, this was one of the most productive areas in the Middle East. And as I said before, more food allows for greater wealth, more surplus, craft specialization. Um, they could support the kinds of specialists that are important in a complex society. The kinds of irrigation that was practiced here was not large scale. It was done on a small scale at first, organized by probably groups of farmers. It was not organized from the top down. But in these historic photos from Iraq from the late 1800s, early 1900s, you can see the river here and some of the canals that were still being used at that time period. So what effect did this have on Mesopotamia? Well, this is a little bit after the Ubaid period, but let's just take a look at these two graphs for a second. This represents northern Mesopotamia, where they relied on rainfall agriculture. And here is the city of Uruk, which is in southern Mesopotamia. And what you see through time is that northern Mesopotamia, there's actually kind of a drop in population. And then that city of Uruk, there's a exponential increase. Part of the reason is because of the food surpluses, but we'll talk some more about that. So what else are rivers good for? They're great for agriculture, but rivers and lakes and oceans still today are used for something besides just agriculture and drinking water. If you had to guess, what would you guess? Trade and transportation. Right? So because Mesopotamians had the Tigris, the Euphrates, and a system of natural canals that connected them, they had a natural highway system. Even today, boat is the most efficient way to transport goods or people. 85 to 90% of the goods that we get from overseas come by boat. Air transportation is far less efficient. Give you an example. When I was trying to mail a package to Australia, it was a small box, less than a pound, and the first choice I had was $60, and we'd get there in less than a week. And we'd go by air. And the other option, which I selected, was which was by ship, and it took 6 weeks to get there, but it was only $6. So you'll see in parts of the Great Lakes still large ships carrying, ore and carrying grain and carrying other things. And in ancient Mesopotamia, they could transport things on the river and also communicate with each other, right? So the area of southern Mesopotamia grew together as one culture because there's a lot of connections between people. So this is historic Iraq again. There's a big round boat you can see here filled with watermelons. As long as you've got a boat that keeps out the water, you can fill it with all sorts of goods, and then it can move by sail, by oar, or even just the current of the river. So extremely efficient even today. And so the Mesopotamians had marshes and canals. That was the second benefit of living in that area. And you can see another boat. This is being pulled by people on the land. If you didn't have a good area like southern Mesopotamia, if you lived in another part of the Middle East where there weren't a lot of rivers, you'd have to move things overland. And this was even, the Ubaid period was before donkeys were domesticated, so you wouldn't even have donkeys to do it. But obviously there's limitations even with animals like donkeys in terms of how far they can go, but also how much they can carry. You can see this guy was probably saying, just one more box. It could hold one more box, right? So ships are the way to go. In fact, we even just use the word to ship something to mean to transport something. Okay, so southern Mesopotamia, those advantages. Disadvantages, no stone, no wood, no metal. They wanted those things later on for their society, and they had to figure out a way of getting them. That involved trade, as we'll see. Okay, so in the Ubaid in southern Mesopotamia, we're going to look at one site in particular, but this is the kind of pottery that existed at that time. Handmade, this was before the wheel, highly decorated with geometric patterns. And then you could see these kinds of things. They look a little bit like boomerangs or bananas. They're made out of clay. These are actually clay sickles. This is how they harvested their wheat and barley. Why didn't they use stone to make blades for their sickles? Because they didn't have any stone. So they had to use clay to make their sickles. Again, the kind of pottery there. We also see figurines that we would consider to be fertility figurines, right? It's a female nursing a young child. Got these strange cone-headed reptilian features. Some people think that indicates divinity. This is my personal opinion. Other figures were found there also male. All right, let's look at one of the most important sites from the Ubaid period. This is the site of Eridu. Later on, when we have full-fledged writing in Mesopotamia, according to the mythology of Mesopotamia, everything started at Eridu. All right, Eridu is located in southern Mesopotamia. Back then, the marshes in Persian Gulf were wider spread than they are today. So Eridu is kind of at the border of the agricultural area and the marshy area. Eridu is a tell site. And when archaeologists started digging at Eridu, they saw that it was a pretty sizable town, but it wasn't a city during the Ubaid period. But they did see that there was a large temple on top of the tell, and that's where they focused their work. So what did they find as they excavated the temple? Well, as they started to excavate the temple, they realized it was a typical kind of Mesopotamian temple, and they mapped it in. And then they continued to dig further down, and what they found was an older temple right underneath. You can see next to it and slightly, it's underneath and slightly next to it. Same outline, same architectural plan, just earlier. They continued to dig next to it. And what did they find? Another temple, older and smaller. They continued to dig again. And what did they find? A slightly earlier temple. Same basic layout, older and smaller. And again, another one and another one and another one, until they got to the beginning of the Ubaid period, where they found this very small temple. Now you can see the people for scale, but this is a typical layout of a Mesopotamian temple. It had an altar area, which would have had the image of the god or goddess. It had an offering table. So what can we make of all this? Well, if we, as we've talked about before with stratigraphy, these archaeologists were having to dig backwards through time. Obviously, the most recent layers are at the top and the oldest layers at the bottom. So once they dug back to the beginning, they kind of thought about things in reverse. And what was going on is that over time, starting from a very small temple, the temples got larger and larger and larger and larger until they got pretty monumental in size, as you can see here. Now, what does this mean in terms of what can we take away from it in terms of looking at Mesopotamia at this time period? Right? Well, I want you to think about a couple questions and maybe write down the answers in your notes, and then, go back to this video. But think if you can come up with an answer with what's the difference between a temple and the kinds of shrines that we talked about in Çatalhöyük. The second question would be, what can we conclude from the fact that these temples are getting bigger and bigger and bigger through time? So by the end of the Ubaid period, they're pretty large. What also can we conclude from the fact that the temples remain basically the same design, and there's kind of an unbroken chain in the same exact location? So why don't you pause the video at this point and then come back when you think you have a couple of answers, and we'll discuss it. Okay, so what did you think? Well, here's what this temple might have looked like at the end, right? And here's some of the river right there and the marsh. A temple is very different from a shrine, because a shrine, as we saw in Çatalhöyük, is in a domestic location. It's in someone's house. It's a room in someone's house. Çatalhöyük had 40-something shrines. At Eridu, there's one major temple. This is public. This is public architecture. But also, the temple is outside of the realm of an individual or a family's house, right? It shows that the religion is essentially an institution at this point, right? Rather than having a family shrine, you have something like today what we would consider, a church, a synagogue, a mosque, a Buddhist temple, right? It's part of a larger institution, which means that who is taking care of the temple? Probably a system of priests, right? So priests are probably the specialists who are taking care of the temple. Now, what about the fact that it's getting bigger through time? Well, many students say, and this is correct, that this probably shows that the population was getting bigger. That's true. Yeah, the population was getting bigger, so you had more people available to do these large kinds of monumental constructions. But also, what does it show about the power of the temple? Obviously, the temples were becoming more powerful. They could motivate and draw up a workforce to build one of these large monuments. So the temple was becoming more powerful through time. The last thing that I would say is that what we see here is, and this is going from about 5,500 BC to about 4,000 BC. So about 1,500 years. That's a very long span of time. Right? That's, if we went backwards in time, that would be 600 AD. Well before modern Europe, backwards from our time period. But it looks like essentially the culture and the religion is intact, right? That is, it's the same basic architecture through this whole period. It's just getting larger. Okay, what else do we see in the Ubaid period at places like Eridu? We see in graves that a few people have a little bit more wealth than other people, right? And these might be some sort of leaders, or they might be a little bit higher in the hierarchy. Okay, so let's put this all together. We've got a pretty big town, not a city though. We have a very large monument. We have evidence of leadership because the monument requires some sort of organization. We've got some people have a little bit more wealth. Now, what kind of society would the Ubaid period of Mesopotamia be? Would it be a band? No, it's obviously more complex and larger than the band. Well, what about a tribe, a big man society? It still seems like it's bigger and more complex than a tribe. A tribe is only 100 to 200 people in a village, and you don't see those kinds of monuments. Well, what about a state or a civilization? Not quite yet. You don't have a city yet, and it doesn't look like you have kind of the kings or high priests that you see in civilizations. So it would probably fit the category of a chiefdom, right? Most likely, Ubaid period Mesopotamia was a chiefdom level society. So they are complex. Chiefdoms are considered complex societies. We have leadership at this period, and it sets the stage for what comes next, right? So we have monumental architecture, a large town, organization, right, and agricultural farming in southern Mesopotamia. So over time, things get bigger, and at a certain point, one particular site gets so large that it really becomes the very first city in the world. And this is a city called Uruk. And we're going to take a look at Uruk, and we're going to see what was going on. So this is around 3800 BC to 3100 BC. When you compare Uruk to some of the major cities of the ancient world that we're kind of more familiar with, like Athens in Greece, or Rome in the Roman Empire, or Jerusalem around the time of Jesus, Uruk is bigger than Athens, it's bigger than Jerusalem, and it's almost as big as Rome during the height of the Roman Empire. Uruk was a major city where 100 to 200,000 people probably lived. And it grew in size very quickly, archaeologically speaking. All right, let's look at the size. This will be a little confusing at first, but I'm going to explain it just to give you an idea of the size. So here's the site of Uruk. Later on, you had kind of these walls that were built around it, not in the beginning of the Uruk period. We're going to talk about the big buildings in the center of the city. These were religious structures, right? But in the beginning, the early middle Uruk, that's what EM stands for, this site was around 70 to 100 hectares. Well, a hectare is a different unit than an acre. What's a hectare? A hectare is basically 2 football fields. All right, so think of this as 140 to 200 football fields put together at the beginning. And then by the end of the Uruk period, it's 250 hectares or 500 football fields in size. And this was not a lot of empty space. This was jam-packed with buildings. This is a very dense urban population. Okay, to give you a little bit more of an idea of scale, what if we dropped Uruk, Mesopotamia on top of the Grand Valley campus? How big would it be? Right? Well, if we did that and you wanted to walk from one end of the city to the center of the city to the other end, you would start at the softball fields, you would walk all the way kind of past the clock tower, then you'd go to the ravines and you'd walk to the other side of the river. And that's a pretty good walk there. That would take you a half an hour. So if you were walking in ancient Uruk, it would take you a good half hour, 45 minutes, probably with a lot of people walking the streets. It would take you more than just walking on campus, filled with people, you could kind of imagine. So very densely populated, large city. If you put it on top of downtown Grand Rapids, it would be from the Pew campus of Grand Valley all the way up to the Medical Mile. So again, still a very dense, large size. Okay, I'll give you another idea in terms of scale. This is a city in northern Iraq called Erbil. This is the city today. This is the ancient part of the city. Right? It's got these medieval walls, a mosque over here, and you can see ancient bazaar and houses and things like that. What are the walls sitting on top of? Well, what do you think this is? This is a tell, right? This is from people living in that spot for hundreds of years, right? So this looks like a pretty sizable tell site, right? This is what it would look like from street level. Gives you an idea of what some of these ancient cities might have looked like way back in the Middle East. Okay, this is the size of Uruk, this bigger circle. This is that citadel with the medieval walls. So you can see how much bigger Uruk is to that site. Uruk is the period of a lot of the beginnings of things. The world's first wheel, right? Many people believe that the wheel was developed for transportation, like carts and things like that. But as we saw already, the boat was the way to go in Mesopotamia. And if you've got soft clay and silt, you really don't want a wheeled vehicle. The wheel was developed to make pottery, right? That's what it looks like the wheel was developed for. We have the world's first plow. We have the world's first kings, potentially. We have the world's first, what we consider organized warfare. We have the world's first writing, although, as I said before, Egypt's a very close second, or some people think of it as first. But we're going to take a look at some of these early firsts in Mesopotamian history and also look at the city of Uruk. A modern name is called Vorka, but we're only going to refer to it as the ancient city of Uruk. Most of the early archaeologists were focused on the center where the big buildings were. Uruk is mentioned in the Bible. It's the city of Erech in Genesis. The hero Gilgamesh, who we'll talk about a little bit, he is the hero of the earliest epic poem in history, the Epic of Gilgamesh. He is called the king of Uruk. Okay, so archaeologists were focused here, and these were very large religious buildings, as we're going to see, but also areas of crafts being produced and storage of different things. So as we will see, the temples at this point were more than just religious structures. Right? Okay, what are evidence for kings? Well, kings are not very powerful at this time period compared to later time periods, as we will see. But many people think that this figurine, which is a few inches high, represents one of the earliest kings in Mesopotamia. Why? Well, because of his haircut. He's wearing a special kind of hairdo that is usually associated with royalty. It's got the bun in the back, as you can see here. Here's a king figure hunting lions. Here is a king figure, you can see, shooting arrows at people, and a building over here, maybe on fire. What is being represented here? Well, if you look, these are actually cylinder seals. Remember we talked about those pieces of clay, of stone that had carvings in them that would be rolled on clay to produce pictures? These are from 2 cylinder seals. So here you can see a king with a spear, people with their hands tied behind them in front of the king. These are most likely captives. Here the king is shooting people with a bow and arrow. This probably represents warfare. The king is a warrior, as a leader of men in battle. Here are different portrayals of the king feeding these goats, the king transporting goods by the river. So different ways of viewing the king. But the king was not very powerful at this point in Mesopotamian history. Right? Okay, so what else do we see in Uruk? Uruk is a very, very large city. This is when we have the first hard scientific evidence for beer in Mesopotamia. It probably goes back before, but we think there probably is a connection between beer and the state. Because as we've said before, beer is a safe drinking supply. Because of the alcohol that's produced, it kills any bacteria or other organisms that could potentially make you sick. So people would not have wanted to drink from the river, where a lot of probably the waste products from the city were emptying out into. They probably wanted to drink the beer because it was a lot safer. And the beer was the gift of a goddess, Ninkasi, who is the goddess of beer. Many brewers were women. This is an ancient tablet. And remember, we talked about writing last week. We're going to look a little bit more at writing, but what this is showing, you can see this jar that has lines on it represents jars of beer. Right? So this is talking about how many, right, in the numbers, jars of beer, how many jars of beer used for different purposes. Right? The way the beer was produced was they would probably have the barley sitting in water. The barley would begin to germinate. As it started to germinate, the complex carbohydrates would be broken down into smaller starches, and then natural yeast would fall in there and start fermenting it. And because they allowed the yeast to sort of float on top of the beer, they typically drank the beer. This is a cylinder seal, as you can see again. They typically drank the beer in groups using straws. The straws would get down below the yeast to the good stuff. Right? And in West Africa, in historical times, they produced a beer using a similar method, and it was also a communal activity, as you can see. They're using these long straws to get down below the yeasty foam at the top and get down to the beer. Right? Here is other cylinder seals where you can see people drinking beer. This pot, they scraped the inside of it and they found chemicals that indicated that beer used to be in this vessel. Right? Okay, so beer was obviously important in civilization. What else do we see? Well, remember we saw those beautiful Ubaid pots? Well, there's a big contrast now in the Uruk period. Once you have civilization, 75% of the pots in Uruk are these really crummy looking flower pot kind of things called beveled rim bowls because the rims are beveled. Now, these were not made with a wheel. These were made super fast, super cheap. What they would do is they would dig a hole in the ground. They would slap in a lump of clay until it formed this kind of shape. They would fire it in the kiln, and they would have a pretty hardy, durable vessel. But the interesting thing is that when they find these beveled rim bowls, they are unbroken but in the garbage, which means that they could have been used again, but they weren't used again. They were used once and thrown away. Anything that's used once and thrown away, we typically would say it's disposable. So these are disposable containers produced in huge quantities. Now, what were they used for? Well, one of the clues comes from the early writing of Mesopotamia, right? Because we looked a little bit at this figure of a head and something that represents bread, which looks a lot like a beveled rim bowl. And we said that this could mean to eat, but the other thing it means is to distribute rations, right? So when you see it on tablets, it means to distribute rations. So this earlier tablet that's talking about beer is probably talking about how much beer they are distributing to probably workers. So why in the Uruk period are they making these beveled rim bowls? Well, and again, finding them in huge quantities. They probably have to come up with a disposable container because they're probably having people come work on very large sites, as we're going to talk about, in the center of Uruk. So imagine, you're a farmer and you're going and you're making mud bricks and you're transporting mud bricks to the building site. And then at the end of the day, you get paid. They pay you in barley. So the people who are in charge of the temple, they had to figure out, okay, we got to allow these people to take the barley home. And, if we ask them to bring the container back, we'll never get the container back. So let's just produce something that we only need to use once. So they produced probably the beveled rim bowl, and the people would line up, get their barley, go back to their home, and then throw the beveled rim bowl away. So what would the comparable example be in our society? What is something that we use to transport something and then we toss it? Some people would say a plastic bag, like from Meyer. We sometimes reuse them, we sometimes recycle them. A lot of times we just bring the groceries home, we throw it away. Or something like the cardboard container for Big Mac or something like that. It's used to give us the Big Mac, and we could take it and go somewhere else, and then we toss it away. So that's probably what's going on with the beveled rim bowls, a container to distribute rations to workers. Okay, well, next we're going to look at the center of Uruk, and we're going to focus on two big areas where they found religious structures. One is a ziggurat. You might have heard of a ziggurat before. That had a white temple on top of it that was dedicated to the sky god Anu. The other area is a whole series of buildings that is called the Ana area. Right? You're going to learn a little bit of Sumerian. Ana means heaven. A means house. So Ana means house of heaven. What did it look like? Well, this is the ziggurat that we'll talk about first. Over here, these series of buildings are the Ana precinct, the house of heaven. Right? Okay, so we will stop here for just a minute, and we will come back and talk about these big religious buildings.